Greetings, comrades. Let us continue our examination of Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality. We are on chapter 10, which is titled For the New World Order. And in this chapter, he gives 3 different examples of U.S. coups / invasions and how the military fully just parroted whatever the White House or the U.S. military apparatus said about the places that they were invading and about the reasons why. So we start with section 1, the totalitarian Sandinistas. In the 20th century, the U.S. invaded Nicaragua 7 separate times, and every time it is to occupy and install a puppet government that is sympathetic to U.S. interests. So in the 70s, Nicaragua was run by a puppet, and at the time there was massive wealth inequality and about a 20% literacy rate. So in 79, the Sandinistas overthrew this puppet government. And by 1984, unemployment had gone from 60% down to 16%. Food equality and availability increased. Health outcomes increased. Vaccine rates increased. And the literacy rate went from 20 to 85%, right? The U.S., not happy about this. The U.S. doesn't like it when poor people succeed. So Reagan, of course, cut aid and enacted trade embargoes. They blew up oil depots and trained and funded the Contras. So the military or the media at the time was just regurgitating this anti-Sandinista propaganda and just fully going along with it, not questioning anything that the Reagan administration was doing. When the Sandinistas won the election in 1984, they claimed that the election must have been rigged. So then the U.S. continued to fund newspapers, the National Endowment for Democracy and the Agency for International Development was funding the counter-narrative, the conservative side, essentially. And in 1990, the Sandinistas lost in a lot of ways because the people wanted an end to these embargoes. So then the U.S. aid returns, and a puppet government was once again in charge. Section 2, the A Devil in Panama. So there was a treaty in 78 when the canal was built that gave Panama, or would give Panama control of the canal by 1999. At the time, there were 14 U.S. military bases in Panama to protect U.S. interests there. And Noriega had been a U.S. puppet since 1967. He was fully working with the CIA. He worked with Oliver North, and he was getting about $200,000 a year from the CIA. But by 1987, he had used up all of his usefulness. So the U.S. decided to indict him for drug smuggling and enacted sanctions, and then unemployment rises. And by 1989, right before the U.S. invaded, Ted Koppel goes on the news and claims that Noriega had actually declared war on the U.S. when 3 days later, December 20th of 89, the U.S. invaded Panama, claiming, or the operation was called Operation Just Cause. They always give these nice names to horrible things. And the news coverage of it looked like an army recruitment ad. They only showed these happy, white-appearing, English-speaking Panamanians that were happy about the U.S. coming in. And of course, the U.S. only reported on our military deaths, never on all of the civilians that were caught up into this. And not until months later did they release a brief report on these mass graves that were buried by U.S. bulldozers. And then, of course, when they finally get to Noriega's office, they claim that he had porn and voodoo dolls and pictures of Hitler and pounds of cocaine. All these things that weren't true, but they just put this out there, right? He was jailed in Florida, and then new puppets were installed. And then, of course, unemployment went up. Opposition media was cut. Labor leaders were jailed. Just all the bad stuff that always happens when the U.S. shows up. In Section 3, celebrating the massacre of Iraq. This is the first U.S. invasion of Iraq in 1991, or 1990. So the U.S. had 300 bases around the world to protect the West from the USSR, but by 1991, there was no longer a Soviet Union. but the bases still remained. So the U.S. needed these client states to protect our, bourgeoisie corporate interest. And in August of 90, Iraq invades Kuwait. We can argue about the reasons why and if that was good or bad, but that has nothing to do with the U.S., right? But the U.S. sanctioned Baghdad, sent troops to Saudi Arabia, claiming that Iraq would invade them. And the media just reported these things as fact. Also, claiming that our own freedom was at stake here in this conflict that had nothing to do with us originally, right? Bush started to claim that Iraq had nukes. Sounds familiar. His son did the same thing 15 years later. Anytime the UN was critical of what the US was doing there, the media wouldn't report on it. But whenever the UN agreed with something the White House said, the media was like, oh, we love the UN, heaping praise. So the media went overboard to demonize Saddam Hussein, claiming that he was worse than Hitler, that we needed to liberate Kuwait, conflating Saddam Hussein himself with the entire nation of Iraq, meaning the whole thing is just bad. Hussein bad, therefore Iraq bad. And Tom Brokaw even said, can the U.S. allow Hussein to live, as if that's our choice? So all-out war in Iraq, media cheers. There's always this sports way we look at these types of things, and it's our team versus the bad team. And, all this war coverage controlled by the military, right? The people in the U.S. weren't seeing anything that wasn't already approved of by the military itself. And they did this to avoid the damage done by the media to the war effort in Vietnam. People saw what was happening in Vietnam and became very against the war, so they didn't want that to happen again. So they hid all of the war crimes that the U.S. was doing in Iraq. The worst censorship really came from the media itself. They would suspend or fire reporters for even being critical of the war. And then, of course, deaths really weren't reported at all. Sometimes American deaths were, but Iraqi deaths were never talked about. The London Times claimed that over 200,000 Iraqis were dead. But the U.S. didn't talk about that. And anytime civilians were bombed, it was always Saddam Hussein's fault. It was his fault for starting this. And therefore, when we bomb civilians, it's actually his fault. Sounds a lot like Israel right now, right? Hamas shouldn't have started this. It's their fault. We destroyed a school. This is also where the 312 babies pulled out of incubators bullshit got started. And again, we see these same lines repeated over and over because they're visceral. They pull on your heartstrings. Who could harm a baby in an incubator? It's all bullshit. It didn't happen. And then, of course, the U.S. bombed Iraq into a pre-industrial stage. Water and sewage treatment plants were destroyed. There was a huge health crisis. It was really bad. And we just didn't hear about it for years later, and really only in alternative sources such as Parenti and other left-leaning media figures, because the mainstream media is not going to tell you all about the war crimes that the U.S. does constantly and still is doing. So that's not a happy ending, but cheers.